Welcome to this video series on creating a secure login system with Angular, Node and MySQL. So in this series we're going to cover how we can create a Node MySQL connection and connecting the backend to an Angular frontend, validating the user input both server side and client side, hashing the password, authenticating requests with JSON Web Tokens, and displaying this in a Angular material reactive form with route guarding and redirecting where appropriate. So in this video I'd like to cover how we can allow users to securely sign up to our application. And I've already created these two folders, they're both empty, backend and front end. So I'll just start by creating the Node server. So I'll cd into the backend folder, and from here this is where we can create our package. So npm init-y, and this will create the package.json file. Now we need to have a few dependencies here, so I'll just go ahead and install these. So we need to do an npm install, and we need Express, which is just a lightweight Node framework. We need MySQL2, which is the latest MySQL connection in Node. Body parser. This will allow our JSON body request to be passed. Express validator. This will validate the fields. bcrypt.js. This will allow our passwords to be hashed and stored in the database. And JSON Web Token, and this will allow a cookie to be created by the server, and this will authenticate and allow users to log in securely. So we can just go ahead and install those. Okay, and we'll also install as a dev dependency nodemon, so we don't have to keep running the command each time to start the server. This will just constantly listen to changes in our folders. And one thing we would like to set up here is just change this test script, and we'll make an npm start script. And all this is going to do is it's going to just start the server by running nodemon for an index.js file that we'll need to create. So in the backend folder, we'll just create that index.js file. And before we create the server, let's actually look at the MySQL and create a database, because we're going to need a table of users to be able to sign up or log in or anything like that. So if I open up MySQL and I create a new schema, actually we might do this with the queries. So we can create a new schema, and I'm going to call this posts. So we'll make a sign in functionality, so a user can sign up, log in, and then if they're logged in they can view some posts. So let's just go ahead and create that schema. Okay, and I'll refresh the schemas and we can see that we have the post schema there. Now what I'll do is I'll create a table, and within the post schema I'll have a so we'll access the schema, and for that post schema we'll create a table and we'll call it users. And what this is going to be is it's going to be a table where there's an ID, of course, to uniquely identify the user, and that's just going to be an integer. It won't be null, and it will auto increment. So that's going to be generated by MySQL, and then when the user signs up, they're going to have a name, and that's just going to be a varchar, and we'll just allow the 255, and that's not null as well. And what I'll do here is I'll just copy this down and just fix up the indentation a little, and I'll change name. They're also going to have an email to log into and a password, and the primary key is of course the ID. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll execute this query here, and if I just refresh and open up posts, open up table, open up users, we can see that we got this blank table here, this blank schema where we can start to put in our sign up details. So back to the node database, the node server that we need to create in the index.js file in the backend. We need to create our server. So we're going to use Express, so let's just require that in. And we're going to pass all our requests, all our JSON requests. So we're going to need the body parser for that. And then we can actually create our application that's going to be the server running. So we can call it app, and that's going to be an express method from the express that we required. Now we're going to create our port. So the port's either going to be on the server or our local port. So we need to account for both cases. So we can have the ports, and that's either going to be equal to the process.env.port, which is the server port if we deploy it, or we can just do it locally on our port 3000. And we want to have a little bit of middleware. So for the application that we've created, we want to use the body parser, and then there's this .json method on that. And if you're not familiar with middleware and the MVC pattern, I've got a course on, well, not a course, I've got a video series on Node, MySQL, and Angular and MVC CRUD application, and they'll get you familiar with all the basics if anything isn't clear in this video. And then what we want to do from there is we can listen to the port. So in Node we create the server ourselves, and that is done by constantly listening to the port number. And I'm just going to have an arrow function here to console.log listening on port, and then I'll have this ES6 template literal syntax to say what port we're on, and this is just going to be a nice message to ourselves to let us know that the server is indeed running. So one thing that we want to do is, because we're connecting this Node server to a Angular application, we're going to run into some cross-origin resource sharing or CORS issues. So what we can do is we can just allow access to different pages, and we'll allow certain methods, and we also need to allow authorization as well, and for the JSON content type, because well, we're going to be using JSON for our requests, and we're going to need authorization for this sign up login project that we're building. So let's just go ahead and we can create that, and we can just add our typical request response next functions in here like that. And it should be noted that we don't need the next function in this body parser, because the body parser actually handles that for us. But when we're creating this custom middleware ourselves, we'll need to allow it to filter through. So the service, brings in all this stuff, and then our request gets filtered through. So the first thing is it's going to be applying the JSON, and then it's going to come to this, and then we're going to perform the next task, and then we're eventually going to add some routes and controllers to handle those requests. So with that said, we need to allow we need to set some headers. So the response, we need to set the header, and there's a header called access control allow origin, and we'll just set it just to star. This means any website or any location can access or make requests to the API on our 3000 port or our node server that we're creating. Now we could have localhost 4200 here, but I'm just going to keep it simple and allow anything. Now that's one of the headers, and we'll need another one, so I'll copy this down. And there's also access control allow methods, and these are the CRUD operations, or there's other ones as well like patch and all that sort of stuff, but I'm just going to put in here the get, post, put and delete. And the final header that we'll use is we want to have access control allow headers, and we want two in particular: content type and authorization. And after we've gone through this middleware, this is where we can call the next, and I'll go to the next thing, and there'll be a route which we'll add shortly. So we can save this, and we can even just test out this is running a simple server by doing npm start, and now we get listening on port 3000. So I'll just exit out of that, because what I want to do is I want to set up our node MySQL connection. So we just created this table here. We want to be able to connect to this data here in our node server, and to do this, what I'll do is I'll create two folders. I'll create a configuration folder, and in here I'll have a config.js, and this is where we'll have the details of our table that we're using. So this is just actually I'll make this JSON, sorry. So I'll rename this to JSON, and this is just going to be our database host. So that's just going to be localhost. We're going to have the user of the MySQL database, so by default this is just root. We need the database name, and we created that schema and we called it post. So post. And finally, the fourth thing that we need is the password itself, and that's for the MySQL database, and I'll just put this in here. So that's my password there, and I'll save the file and close it. We have the connection details themselves, but we need to actually create the connection. So we've got the configuration details in a folder config. Let's create a new folder, and we'll call it util. And inside util, we'll have a database.js file. And it's here that we can, well, we need to require the MySQL package. So let's just grab that in there by requiring that MySQL2 package that we installed earlier. And we also need the configuration details that we just created, so we can require that in. We can just go back one directory to the config folder in the config.json file, and that's going to allow us to separate the two. So if I wanted to, I could have a git ignore file to ignore the configuration settings, and I could still post up this code, commit it, and it also adds that extra security by an extra layer of separation there. But it should be noted that the node files themselves, you can't view them in the browser, so you could directly type them in if you wished as well. So we need to create the constant connection, and we create a connection pool, which is how we constantly listen to requests from MySQL and Node. So let's just go ahead and create a pool, and that's just mysql.create pool, and this takes in the JSON object that we just created. So there's the host, and that's config.host, and I'll just do this. So there's the user, the database, and the password. And we need to export this so it's available where we are dealing with modifying the database. So probably a model where we have static methods to interact with the database, and we can do it just by exporting that as a promise. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and create our model. So we'll create a folder called models, and we'll create our user model. So I'll close this database because we don't need it any longer, but we'll import it in because we'll need it in the user model. So we'll acquire that in, and that's just back a directory in util in database. And with that connection to the database, we can sort of create our model. So we can just export that, which is just a class, and we'll call it user with a capital U. And inside the constructor, when we instantiate a new user, it's going to take a name, an email, and a password because the ID is generated automatically for us. And we can just set all of those values. So this.name equals name, this.email equals email, and this.password equals password. And these should all be inside the body of the constructor. Okay. So we haven't actually done any MySQL queries yet, and let's say that on this user class we want to save a new user, or we might want to find a user based on their email to check if their corresponding password is correct. So we're going to need to create a couple of MySQL queries here, and we're going to make static methods so we don't have to instantiate the object. We can just do it on the class itself. So the first one I'll do is the ability to save a user, and this is where we use our database, and we can just return an execution of a query. So on the DB we can execute a particular query here, and it's just going to be MySQL. So we're going to insert into the users table that we just created, and remember that the DB connection let us know that we're in the schema posts. So in the users table in post, we want to insert a name, email, and password, and so they're the columns that we want to insert into, and we want to insert 3 values here. And to avoid SQL injection, we can do it like this, and we can then pass those in, and this will escape any quotes or anything like that. So if someone was to type in a name and a password in the fields in the client, if they were to type in drop database or anything to unauthorized get access to certain information from a database or delete it entirely, this will just escape that. So escape the strings, the quotes, so it's read as a string, and not a SQL query itself. So that's why we have this additional measure here to pass the corresponding values in. And since we're passing the user into the method, the user is going to have a corresponding name, email, and password that we can pass in. So user.name, user.email, and user.password. So that's one of the methods we'll use to insert into our database a new user. Now this password will need to be hash, so password's not there in plain sight, but we'll get to that in just a minute. There's one more method I'd like to create, and that's the ability to find a user based on an email. So we can just return a query here where we select everything from the users table where the email is equal to the email that they passed, and that's just simply the email. Okay, so we've created our user model. The next thing we want to do is create some routes. So there's an endpoint that the user can hit. So in backend, let's create a new folder called routes. And these routes that we're dealing with here, these are the authentication routes. So I'll just call this auth.js. And okay, so we're going to need Express firstly. So let's acquire that. And this is where we're going to do validation. So when a user sends their name or email and password to the server, so they type it in an input field and then they send it off to the server, the server needs to actually validate a few things here. So it needs to validate that the email address doesn't already exist, because then we would have a duplicate entry in our database and we don't want that. But we also want to, we want to do a few things, like we want to get rid of any white spaces or extra spaces or anything like that. But we also want to make sure that the request or the input isn't empty, or perhaps it's a certain length for security measures for the password. So that's why we need that package we installed earlier, and there's a body sort of functionality here that we can take from the Express Validator package. And this intercepts the body, so the fields that you sent to the server, and then it does the check, and if it doesn't meet the check, it won't go on to the route or the controller that's performing the necessary actions to the server that we are interested in. So this is the server-side validation of the input, basically. And we just created this user model where we can find a user, and that's what we're going to use it for, is just making sure we don't have duplicate users. And if not, then we can save it into the database. So we can just go ahead and get that user model in by requiring it from models. And we're going to, after it passes, we're going to need to handle this in a controller. So actually, I won't input it just yet, but I will create this controllers folder just in preparation of handling it. And I'll also create a auth.js controller here, and I'll just leave that blank just for now. But what we want to do is, when we receive the request to a certain route, which we also haven't set up just yet, we need to validate the data. So we can just get the router here, and this will just allow us to make requests from another location. So in the index file, we're going to have a route to auth, but then we're also going to have a next layer for the sign up, because there's going to be a distinguish between the authentication for the sign up and the login method that we're yet to create. So okay, so now we can use the router, and for a post request, so we're going to post a username and a password to sign up to. This is going to have the route /sign up. So really, from the index, we're going to hit a route localhost 3000/auth, and we haven't created that in the index just yet, but we will. And then we hit this /auth/sign up route, and then we're going to use the body express validator to make sure a few things are happening before we actually pass that request to the controller. And we can access the body, and for the name, so recall we've got name, email and password. There's a few methods here. So firstly, we want to trim it to get rid of any of the space, and then we want to check that it's not empty. So we have not is empty, So that's the name. The email. So for the email field, we want to check a few things here. We want to make sure that it is an email, and I'll just check that, you know, there's an @symbol.com or whatever, and that's built in, so we don't have to worry about that with regular expressions or anything like that. It's probably happening under the hood. But if there is an error, we can have this with message, and we can just say, okay, please enter a valid email. And we can also create a custom handler. So we want to check if an email already exists, and we have this method here where it selects the row based on the email. So if that exists, that means, you know, it's a duplicate and we don't want to continue on with the, making the request. So we can actually have this custom function here, this custom behavior, and this is going to be an async function. So it's going to take the email, and then it's going to so we'll just create this variable here, const user, and since it's an async function, we can use await. So we can await for the user.find email. So that's just the SQL query once again. So this is an asynchronous operation, so we use the async await, and we're awaiting for a response to come back from the connection to the MySQL database. So that's going to look in here, and then if a row exists for the particular email that we've entered here, well, then we're going to have some sort of response there. So another way to think about that is, okay, so if, and we're going to do an if check, so if the user, and it's the first element in the array, has a length of greater than 0, that means, you know, and it can only really be 1, that means one email already exists. So in that case, we don't want to continue on, and to sort of reject that case. So if more than one email exists, that means a user already with that email address already exists. So we actually want to reject that, and we can reject the promise, which is required in this custom handler here. We can reject the promise, and what this will do is it will actually create an error, and it'll put an error, and that will get passed through into the controller, and we'll see that in a moment, and then we can check if there's any errors. Don't continue on. But yeah, we can say that email address already exists. Okay, so that's one thing. Let's see here. Just got to get my brackets right. So that's here, I think. One more thing we want to do is we want to normalize the email, and this just does things like, you know, if you had uppercase letters or something like that, like let's say the user typed in JON all uppercase at gmail.com, but it's also valid to enter in lowercase JON at gmail.com. It just normalizes it so that entries that mean the same thing, you know, you can access it in a normalized way. Okay, so that's the email field. Now there's also password. So we can create a body here for the password, and once again we can just trim that, and we can just say is length, and we need a minimum length, so we can just sort of pass this object here, and this would work for maximum as well, and there's other things we can do here. But I just want to check that it's at least 7 characters long, and if it hits, and this validation will be required when they hit the sign up route. So it requires validation for the name, email, and password. And we'll need to create a controller here, and I'll just call it the auth controller. And there's going to be a sign up functionality here. And this is going to be created here. So in the controllers, there's this auth controller here, and that's where we're going to catch any of these errors and not perform the operation if it has some sort of validation error here. And the final thing we just need to do here is we just need to do a module.exports for the router, so we can just export this back out so it's accessed elsewhere, and then we'll just reformat that with prettier. So that's the route and the validation on the route. Now we need to create the controller, and there's actually another method from the same package. So before we use body, now we're going to use the validation result, and that's just simply on the express validator. You collect the validation result, and there's an extra method for that, validation result, and that's done just by requiring the same package, express validator. So we're going to, okay, so to use, alright, let's just create the functionality first, and then we'll import a few more things. But I'm going to have this sign up functionality here, and it's just going to be an asynchronous function. Oops. An async function which takes the request, response, and next. And we're going to check a few things here. And the first thing we can do is we can just get our errors, if there are any errors, by using this validation result on the request. So we make a request, and the request has the name, the email, and the password in the body. And then with that request body, we can look at if there's any errors with the validation result package. So what we can do is we can just simply check if, if errors is empty, that means everything's all good. So we want to make sure that we're handling the case where everything's not good. So if errors is not empty, that means there are errors. We can just return here, and then thus the server-side validation is preventing the request from hitting the full endpoint by the handling that's done by the soon-to-be controller that's going to be made. So, okay. And then, of course, you know, we can get the name from the request.body.name, and the same thing can be done for the email and password. So email, password, okay. And so this password is the password the user has sent, so it's not hashed or anything just yet, it's just the raw password at this stage. But what we want to do is we want to hash it, meaning we want some sort of encryption on it, or some sort of code that you can't reverse. So hashing is different to encryption in the sense that encryption, you can, if you know the encrypted result, there's a way to unencrypt it. But in hashing, or in the bcrypt library in particular, so let's get that. There's a hashing function that it takes the code. It takes the text and encrypts it so that you can't get the string back. So if you type in the word password, you're going to get this big long combination of numbers and special characters and stuff. Like you might get $2E and a really long one, and that won't be the same for the same password that you type in. It's just a hash. It's just something that you can't reverse engineer that represents something. So the idea is you don't actually store the passwords in the database, because if it gets hacked or something like that, then the person who hacked it, they'll have access to all the passwords and stuff like that. But if it's just a hash there, they won't be able to do anything with it, because it's essentially meaningless unless you check for that hash. And there's a way to, what we're doing is we're not actually going to decode that, we're just going to check that it's the same as the hash, and we'll see that in just a moment. But first I just need to get the bcrypt library in here. Okay, so that means, and in the controller here, when we're doing anything asynchronous, I'll just wrap this in like a try catch block. So there's a try, and then there's going to be a catch, and then I'm going to catch any errors if they exist. I'm going to handle that in some way. So in the try part, what we want to do is we want to hash the password. So let's create this variable here. So hashed password, and we just want to await. So we made this an asynchronous function, so we could await for the bcrypt.hash to be applied. And we just typed in this 12 because 12 seems to be the conventional number. That's how many times the hashing algorithm has been applied. So for example, if you type in the word password as your password, and then you do the algorithm once, you might get something like, like this, some random string back, but then you do it again, and then you're hashing this, and then you might get back something like that, and it's done 12 times. So even if you type in the same password, the hash won't, and another user types in password, might get something like this, and then this, and it's just the layers of security to ensure that there's a secure store for your password in the database. So anyway, we've secured the password. So right now there's no password in the database, it's just the user sent their password in the input field and they made a request to this API, and assuming that it met all of the validation, otherwise we just don't perform any task, we extract the details, and then in particular we're hashing the password here. So what we need to do is we need to save that data to the database, and we've already checked that it's not a duplicate with this custom validation here, but the other method was save. So if we can just save the name, email and password, where the password is the hashed password and not the password directly, then we're able to successfully sign up our user in a secure way. So let's just go ahead and create a constant variable here. I'll just call it user details, and this will just be the object, the JSON that we're passing in the body. So name, email, password, and it's very important that you write hashed password here. And then what we'll do is we'll perform that save operation. So we'll have this constant here, and that's just going to await for the user.save, and that's just going to take in the user details that we just created here. So this object here, user details, is in fact the user here, and then you access the name, email, and hash password, and then that's what's going to be inserted into the database. So all we have to really do now is just make the request. So to make the request, all we need to do is just, we have our response to the request, and we're going to just say, because a new resource is created, we've got a 201, and it's JSON formatted, and we can just log back to the person a message saying a user is registered. And now we want to catch any errors that occur, so let's just do that. So what I'll do is I'll say okay, so I'll handle this in the sense that if there's no error status code with the error that's been passed, we can just say that there's a server error. So we can just say, and obviously you don't want this for every case, but just for the sake of handling this one, we can just say if the status code of the error is not set, we can just set it to a 500, which implies that we want to actually set certain error codes for certain situations, and if that situation hasn't been applied, then we just give it a 500. So, and then we need to call this middleware that we need to create, and we pass that in like that. So we just call the next middleware error middleware. So we can actually make that in controllers here, and I'll just save this here. But in controllers, I'll create this error middleware. And okay, so I'm going to have two cases here, just the two most common cases, and I'm just going to have the a get 404, which is just going to be a request, a response, and next. And what this is going to do is this is just going to we're just going to throw an error here. So so we can just say, okay, we can just make an error, and we can just create a new error, and we can just say not found, and then we can assign it a status code. So error.status code equals 404, and then we just go to the next error. And then we can also do a similar thing, and we'll just do that for the 500. And you could of course do this for many cases, but let's just say get 500, and this just takes an extra parameter error. So what's happening here is so like from this controller, this middleware for the next error has been called. So if you're calling the next error, there's this particular middleware where it has this error here, and this fourth parameter, or this first optional error parameter, is recognized by Node, so that when you call this next error function here, it gets passed into here and handled in this place here. So what we can say here is we can just say, okay, we need to access the data of the error. So when you pass the error, we've assigned a status code to the error, but there's also a data with it, and that's just the, if you get a 200, it's okay, but, well, that's not really an error, but if you get a 404, it's not found. There's all sorts of different error codes for different things, and then there's associated data with that. So, that's actually the message, but then there's data associated with that message as well. So the data is error.data, and what we want to do is we want to say we want to assign a status to the response. So we want the status, so just like here when we had this status here for the response, if it was successful, a resource was created. So we created 201, but this is going to be an error response, and it's going to have either the status code that we assigned it, like a 404 or 500 or something like that. But let's say it's a 404. That 404, that will only exist if it's been assigned a status code. So we can say that the res.status is just going to be the error.the status code that we created, or we'll just assign it 500. So in this case here, this 404 error, this is going to be, we're going to have an error not found, and we're going to assign a status code of 404, but then we're going to call this next error function here. And this get 500, this is like the final error handling. I'm going to put it last. So it's not only the 500, but it's handling all of the accumulated errors that get passed through this next error here. So what we can do here is we can say, okay, for the response, so it could be a 404, but if it's not, it's going to be a 500. But then that's where we can actually give our response back, and that's just going to be in JSON once again. And we're going to have an error associated with that, and it's just going to have a message, which will be the error.message, and the data, which we've just extracted here like that. So now all we really need to do is we just need to update the index.js with the auth routes and controllers and the error handling capabilities. So we can just say, okay, where is that? Okay, so we've required everything in that we need. We just need one more thing, and that is the auth routes. So I'll just get that here. So I need the auth routes, and we can just require in the auth routes from the routes folder in auth, and we need to handle that route. So we can say, once we go through the middleware of passing the JSON and setting the headers, what we can do is we can just use a particular route here, and I'm just going to use /auth, and then I'm going to put in the auth routes here like that. So once again, what this is doing is you have this server constantly running, and then if you hit localhost /auth, we can look in the auth routes, and then if we hit localhost 3000 /auth/sign up with a post request, we can validate the input and then handle it appropriately as we have here, and handle the errors as well. So with that, that's handling the auth routes, and we've done this because later we're going to have the login route, so /auth/login in like a meaningful section with structure. And if we make a request to the server but it's not that route, we're going to say just use the 404. So there's the error controller here, and we don't need to pass the route because the route isn't known at this point. So if it doesn't reach this endpoint here, /auth /something like /signup, we're going to say there's a 404, and then that error is just saying, okay, nothing could be found, return a 404, and then return the 404 message and data. Otherwise, let's say the route does exist, but there's the server's down, or there's some sort of error going there that we haven't assigned a particular status code to, then last case scenario is we're going to say that there's a server error. And to handle the server error, what we can do is we can just do the same thing as we did here, but instead of a 404, we're going to get the 500. And that's how we can handle the errors that occur. So let's just do a demonstration of this. So let's say I do an npm start. Okay, I have an error here, so the auth controller is not defined. Okay, and of course that would be true because in our routes folder we didn't actually reference this auth controller signup. I just put it there without taking into consideration. So what we can do is we can just import that in here. So I'll just get the auth controller by requiring in the auth controller that we just created from the controllers /auth, and I think the same thing has happened for this error controller here. So in the error controller, in the index file, we need to get the error controller as well. So let's just get that here. So const error controller equals require, so the controllers /error. So let's save that. Okay, so now we have our application listening for requests. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up Postman here, and I'm going to hit this post route, http //localhost .3000 auth sign up. And one thing to note in the body is I've got this name, email and password in this JSON format here. So I'm just going to change this to password like this, and then I'm going to make the request. And something probably went wrong. So another thing that needs to be added in the controllers in the auth is you actually need to import the user module, the user model. So we can just import that in here. Because that's being used in the controller here to save the details of the user. So let's just go ahead and we can do that. And now if we make our Postman request, we make this Send request here. Okay, and one more thing is changing this module export to exports in the configuration in the database here. So with that, we can send this request and we get this back, user registered. And if we check our database here, we can see that we've got this encrypted, or this hashed password here. And I just added this entry before for troubleshooting. But if we were to make a request to say s/ and we send that, we get our error handling not found. So okay, so with that, that's how we can create a secure way to sign up through hashing. So just to recap what we did there, we created a MySQL connection, and then we made a server, and we allowed for certain types of origin methods and headers. We created the routes to the file, to the index. So this server's constantly listening. They hit the auth route, and then within the auth route, they hit this sign up route. You know, we fixed up the data and check it's not empty. We validate it, and if it's valid, we can continue to make the request. Otherwise, we just stop and we reject the promise here. And to handle that request, what we do is we hash the password based on the data that they put in if there's no errors, and you know, we can just save that, assuming that it's not, or they're not already registered. Otherwise, we handle the errors appropriately. So thanks so much for watching the sign up video. In the next video, what we'll do is we'll cover how to do the front end of this. So we'll handle the forms. So we'll use reactive forms in Angular, and we'll also do material UI, and then eventually we'll connect it all up, and we'll connect the client side up to the server side. So stay tuned for that one.